The man standing at the teller counter looked like he had spent the last 8 hours hauling stone, not moving millions. His canvas work jacket was dusted with fine gray concrete powder, and his steel-toed boots were worn from miles of steady walking. He didn't look like the kind of person who belonged in the sterile, air-conditioned sanctuary of the First Continental Bank. But he was there. He had a check in his hand, and for the next few minutes the entire world of this pristine financial institution was about to implode, because a man named Craig Bellworth thought he could judge a book by its dirt-streaked cover. You think you know how this story goes? The power trip, the arrogance, the inevitable fall. But you haven't seen the way the silence felt in that lobby when a regional vice president suddenly sprinted out of the back office, his face pale, screaming a question that silenced every heartbeat in the room. This wasn't just a bank interaction. It was the moment a carefully constructed bubble of professional vanity burst. It was a Tuesday morning, 9:14 a.m. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and old accumulated wealth. Desmond Turner stepped into the lobby, a man whose hands were rough from labor, but whose mind was sharp as a diamond. He walked to window 3, placed a cashier's check for $285,000 on the marble slab, and waited for the routine. He didn't know that the man behind the frosted glass, the branch manager, was already watching him with the kind of disdain usually reserved for a stain on a white rug. Craig Bellworth didn't see a client. He didn't see a depositor. He saw a nuisance, an anomaly, a stray that needed to be chased out of his sight. The interaction that followed was a masterclass in dehumanization, a systematic attempt to strip a person of their dignity in plain view of a dozen witnesses. Bellworth approached the window, his movements practiced and cold. He didn't greet Desmond. He didn't look at the check as a financial instrument. He looked at it as a lie. "Where did you steal this?" he asked, his voice barely rising above a whisper loud enough to cut through the hum of the air conditioner. It was a question designed to wound, to intimidate, to put a man back in his place. Desmond, whose life was built on foundations much firmer than the bank's marble floors, remained perfectly still. He understood exactly what was happening. He had felt the weight of that gaze before the judgment that precedes the truth. The assumption that because he wore work clothes, he couldn't possibly possess wealth. The bank lobby grew unnervingly quiet. It was the kind of quiet that happens when people realize they are witnessing an injustice, but are too terrified of the consequences to intervene. A mother holding her toddler at the next window froze. An elderly couple sat paralyzed on the plush leather chairs. Everyone was watching. Everyone was complicit. Bellworth, fueled by the intoxicating high of petty power, snatched the deposit slip from the counter. He didn't check the account. He didn't look at the verification logs. He took the paper, crumpled it into a tight, ugly ball, and tossed it into the trash can next to his desk with a flick of his wrist. It was an act of pure, distilled malice. The sound of the paper hitting the bottom of the bin was the loudest noise in the building. It was the sound of a reputation being shredded. But Desmond didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just watched Bellworth, his expression unreadable, waiting for the storm that he knew was coming. He knew that when you treat a man like trash, you eventually have to answer for the mess you've made. And behind the frosted glass, the truth was already starting to wake up. The air in the lobby had turned thick and heavy like the atmosphere before a massive thunderstorm. Every person in that room could feel the static, the tension radiating from the marble counter where Desmond Turner stood motionless as a mountain. Bellworth, however, was riding the crest of his own arrogance. He was so caught up in the thrill of asserting his authority over someone he deemed lesser that he failed to notice the subtle shifts in the room, the way the teller Elaine had her hands trembling under the desk, or the way the security guard Terrence had his weight shifted, his eyes darting between the manager and the exit. Bellworth felt like the king of his small gated kingdom. He thought he was protecting the bank. He thought he was doing his job. In reality, he was digging his own professional grave. He leaned in close, his voice dripping with a mix of condescension and something much darker, a deep-seated irrational bias that colored everything he saw. "I'm protecting this institution from people like you," he sneered, the words carefully chosen to sting. He didn't know that the man he was addressing had more influence in his little finger than Bellworth had in his entire career. He didn't know that every interaction in that bank was being watched not just by customers, but by a system that was about to scream error. Desmond remained steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He knew that the truth didn't need to shout to be heard. "I'm asking you for the policy," Desmond said, his voice calm, measured, and dangerously articulate. "You've made an accusation of fraud without verifying the document. That isn't policy. That's a personal choice." The term personal choice hung in the air sharp and undeniable. Bellworth's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to being obeyed. He was the one who decided who belonged and who didn't, who was a customer and who was a threat. He puffed out his chest, trying to regain the dominance he felt slipping away. He gestured to the police officers he had called on a whim, thinking they would be his enforcement arm, his muscle. He expected them to come in and drag Desmond away to validate his prejudices and restore the order he believed he had defended. He didn't realize that in the modern world, truth isn't something you hide in a back office. It's something that gets recorded, shared, and exposed. As the officers approached, they weren't looking at Desmond with suspicion anymore. They were looking at Bellworth with skepticism. They saw the crumpled slip in the trash. They saw the calm man at the counter. They saw a situation that smelled entirely of a manufactured crisis. The younger officer, a man with a steady gaze, looked at the check again. He compared it to the screen on the computer. He saw the verification, the clearance, the legitimacy of the entire transaction. He turned to Bellworth, his tone shifting from helpful to investigative. "Sir, you called us for a fraud report," the officer said, his voice clipped and professional. "But the system says this is a routine cleared transaction. Can you explain exactly what the suspicion is based on?" Bellworth stammered. The words he had used so easily before now felt heavy and foreign. It's my judgment. The profile, it just didn't feel right." The word profile dropped like an anvil. Everyone in the lobby heard it. The officers exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They weren't just security anymore. They were witnesses to a systemic failure. The lobby, which had been silent for so long, began to stir with the quiet, urgent energy of people who realize the narrative has flipped. The victim was no longer the one under the light. It was the man in the white shirt and the expensive tie. Bellworth tried to backpedal, to find an excuse to blame the system, to blame anyone, but the reality was closing in on him. He was standing on shifting sand, and the tide was coming in fast. And he still didn't know the one thing that would finish him. The regional vice president was already on her way out of the back office, and she had seen everything. Sandra Whitmore did not walk. She moved with the precision of a hurricane. Her footsteps on the marble floor were like gunshots, sharp and rhythmic, signaling a total change in the environment. She didn't look at the officers. She didn't look at the customers. Her eyes were locked onto the back of Craig Bellworth's head, a target she had been observing for far too long. The office behind the tellers was usually a place of quiet, administrative peace, but today it was the source of the shock wave that was about to level the branch. As she crossed the distance, her face wasn't twisted with rage. It was set in a mask of cold, hard disappointment. She had been conducting a routine compliance audit, a process she usually did with a mix of thoroughness and detachment. But today, she had heard the words fraud and animal drift through the vents, and it had transformed her audit into an intervention. She reached the counter and stopped directly between the manager and the man he had tried to destroy. She didn't look at Bellworth immediately. She turned to Desmond, first, her posture softening in a way that surprised everyone. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "I am Sandra Whitmore, the regional vice president. I have been in the back office, and I have heard everything that transpired here. I want to apologize, not just on behalf of this branch, but on behalf of the dignity that should have been afforded to you from the moment you walked through those doors." The room went completely still. Even the officers stepped back, sensing that a higher authority had taken control of the narrative. Bellworth looked like he had been struck by lightning. His jaw hung slack, his eyes wide as he looked from Sandra to Desmond. He tried to speak, to offer some pathetic justification, but the words died in his throat. Sandra finally turned to him, and her gaze was enough to make a lesser man crumble. "Craig," she said, her voice dropping an octave, sounding like ice cracking on a lake. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" Bellworth couldn't answer. He couldn't even think. His brain was scrambling to process the shift in power, the sudden realization that the man he had treated like a stray was in fact the most important client in the entire region. Sandra held up her tablet, the screen brightly displaying a profile that Bellworth had never bothered to look at. "Desmond Turner," she announced, her voice filled with a stern professional gravity. "Founder of Turner Capital Group, $2.1 billion in assets under management, the single largest private depositor in our entire Southeast Division. His risk rating is 0, and yet you saw fit to treat him like a criminal." She looked around the lobby, making sure the message was received by everyone present. "You threw his deposit in the trash. You called the police on a loyal client who has been with us for years simply because you looked at his clothes and decided you knew his worth. You have failed this bank, you have failed your team, and most importantly, you have failed the integrity that this institution represents." Bellworth stood there, his world collapsing in real time. The smirk, the arrogance, the self-important authority, it all peeled away like scorched paint. He wasn't the manager of a bank anymore. He was a man caught in the spotlight of his own failures. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a legacy ending. The customers in the lobby watched their faces transformed from fear to something akin to grim satisfaction. They knew. They understood exactly what had happened. They saw the hypocrisy unmasked, the elitism confronted, and the truth, for once, standing on the right side of the counter. Sandra's hands were steady, her focus total. She was dismantling Bellworth's authority piece by piece, and the worst part for him was that he couldn't stop it. He couldn't argue. He couldn't defend himself. He had been exposed, and the exposure was final. The humiliation was complete, but for Bellworth the reality was only just beginning to sink in. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, his entire posture conveying a man who had suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. The regional vice president didn't just fire him. She erased his authority. She stripped him of the titles and the power he had used to intimidate others for years. The police officers who had been called to protect the bank were now essentially witnessing a corporate execution. They watched with a mixture of professional interest and moral approval as Sandra dictated the terms of his removal. "Hand over your keys and your badge, Craig," she commanded. "You are suspended effective immediately. An internal investigation into your conduct over the last 2 years will commence in an hour. We are going to audit every single transaction you have flagged in that time, and God help you if we find the pattern I think we're going to find." The mention of 2 years sent a tremor through Bellworth. He knew he hadn't just mistreated Desmond. He had been systematically discriminating against dozens of people, all while hiding behind the veneer of bank policy. He had operated with the assumption that nobody would ever call him out, that he could use his position as a shield to satisfy his own biases. But he had finally pushed someone who had the power to push back, and the resulting momentum was unstoppable. He reached into his pocket, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely get his keys out. He laid them on the counter, the same counter where he had been so quick to judge, so quick to dismiss, so quick to hate. He turned to look at Desmond, hoping for a moment of grace, a shred of empathy. But all he found was a cold, impenetrable calm. Desmond wasn't angry anymore. He was finished. He was done with the games, done with the theater of it all. He simply collected his cashier's check, placed it back in his envelope, and tucked it under his arm. He didn't gloat. He didn't even yell. He just looked at Sandra with a weary, knowing expression that said more than 1,000 words could. "This isn't about me," Desmond said, his voice quiet, but carrying throughout the lobby. "It's about the people who don't have the position I have. It's about the woman who walked in here with a smaller check and was told to leave. It's about the systemic assumption that people like me don't belong here. If I hadn't been who I was, I would be on my way to a station right now, wouldn't I?" Sandra didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was the answer. Bellworth looked at the floor, the weight of his actions finally pinning him down. He had been a king in his own mind, and now he was a pariah in the eyes of everyone who knew the truth. As the officers guided him toward the exit, his walk was tentative, his head bowed. The doors of the bank, once a portal to his power, were now just exits to a life that had been permanently altered. The lobby exhaled a collective breath. The tension didn't just dissipate. It transformed into something else, a shared realization of what had just been witnessed. It was a moment of accountability, raw and unvarnished. The young man who had been recording from the window stood up, pocketing his phone, and walked over to Desmond. "I caught all of it," he said, his voice quiet and respectful. "If you need it, it's yours." Desmond nodded, a gesture of thanks for a fellow citizen who had chosen not to look away. The mother with the toddler stepped up next, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you for staying," she whispered. "Thank you for showing us that we don't have to be afraid." It was a moment of profound connection, a rare instance where the collective witness of a community actually shifted the ground beneath their feet. The bank would never be the same. The people who were there would never be the same. And Desmond, the man in the work jacket, walked out the door and into a morning that felt for the first time in a long time like the start of something genuinely new. The aftermath began before Desmond had even reached his car. By the time he was pulling out of the parking lot, the video had already been uploaded. The digital ripple effect was immediate, turning a single morning's event into a national conversation about fairness, bias, and the power of witnesses. The video didn't just show a manager throwing away a deposit slip. It showed the face of prejudice in the 21st century. It was raw, unedited, and impossible to ignore. Within hours, the clip had millions of views. It was on every social media platform, on every major news network, and most importantly, it was the subject of intense scrutiny by the bank's corporate headquarters. They weren't just dealing with a PR nightmare, they were dealing with the potential for massive regulatory intervention. The CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was on the case almost before the dust had settled. They didn't care about PR, they cared about law. And the law in this case was very, very clear. The investigation, which was initially supposed to take weeks, was accelerated because the evidence was everywhere. The bank found that Bellworth had been doing this for years, flagging legitimate transactions from minority clients, overriding teller approvals, and creating an environment where intimidation was the primary tool of risk management. But it wasn't just the bank that suffered. The merger they were so desperate to finalize was put on hold, then downgraded, then ultimately settled for hundreds of millions less than its initial valuation. Bellworth's prejudice had real quantifiable costs, and the bank's shareholders were going to make sure he paid for them. But while the news cycle obsessed over the money and the corporate fallout, the real story was in the lives of the people who had been touched by the event. Elaine, the teller at window 3, had finally found her voice. She didn't just quit. She became a whistleblower, providing the logs that proved the pattern of abuse. She ended up working for a community-based bank, helping people who had been turned away elsewhere. She became the gatekeeper of a different kind, one that focused on welcoming rather than excluding. Terrence, the security guard, went back to school. He was done with being just a uniform. He wanted to be an advocate. He took his share of the settlement and invested it in his future, proving that the lessons learned on that Tuesday morning weren't just about the past. They were about the trajectory of the future. And Desmond, he didn't wait for the bank to apologize. He didn't wait for the PR statement. He moved his entire firm's portfolio, all $440 million of it, to a locally owned bank that shared his values. He didn't just move his money, he moved his influence. He created new opportunities, funded literacy programs, and became a beacon for people who needed to know that their presence mattered. The bank, where the incident happened, was forced to undergo a total transformation. They had to implement new rigorous training programs, mystery shopper audits, and a direct line to corporate for any customer who felt they were being treated differently. They had to earn back the trust of the community, and they had to do it by admitting that the culture they had allowed to fester was toxic. It was a victory not just for Desmond, but for anyone who had ever walked into an establishment and felt the cold chill of being unwelcome. It was a reminder that you don't have to shout to be powerful. You just have to be present, you have to be right, and you have to be willing to hold the line. The video is still out there floating in the digital ether, a permanent reminder of one man's arrogance and another man's resolve. It serves as a testament to the fact that prejudice, no matter how institutionalized it seems, can be dismantled if enough people refuse to look away. Every time someone watches that video, they see themselves. They see the lobby, they see the trash can, they see the choices, the choice to stand by or the choice to stand up. And that is a legacy that no amount of corporate PR can ever erase. It is the story of a Tuesday morning that changed everything, a reminder that the small actions we take every day define the world we live in. It shows that even in a world of high-value transactions and corporate power, the most important asset any of us has is our integrity. And when that is challenged, the response can change the course of history. The digital footprint of the incident remained long after the corporate apologies had been filed and the fines had been paid. The video itself became a permanent exhibit in the Museum of Modern Social Interactions. It showed up in marketing classes, in corporate diversity training modules, and in the background of news reports about civil rights. It was a haunting 7-minute reminder of what happens when power is divorced from empathy. For Bellworth, the story ended in a much smaller, quieter place. After the fallout, the legal fees, the public disgrace, and the industry ban, he found himself in a world that was unrecognizable from the one he had once dominated. He moved to a small town, took a job in the finance office of a local car dealership, and learned the true meaning of humility not as a choice but as a consequence. He would sometimes hear someone mention the video or catch someone looking at him with recognition, and he would have to look down at his desk and keep working. He was no longer the one making the decisions. He was now just the one processing the forms. The power he once cherished had become a distant, embarrassing memory. But the people who were victims of his policies had moved on to bigger and better things. They had taken the adversity and turned it into fuel. The small businesses that had been denied loans were eventually funded by community-owned banks that focused on potential, not just pedigree. The young people who saw the video were energized to enter the workforce with a different understanding of their rights and their value. They weren't just going to be employees. They were going to be architects of a new kind of business environment. The bank First Continental had spent millions trying to repair its image. They hired consultants, rebranded their offices, and put out ads featuring diverse faces and heartwarming stories. But the public wasn't fooled. They remembered. They knew that a brand is not what you say about yourself, but how you treat the person who walks in the door with a deposit. The real change happened on the ground, in the quiet day-to-day interactions that define the soul of an institution. It happened when a teller took an extra second to listen, when a security guard offered a genuine smile, and when a manager decided that their job was to enable, not to judge. That is where the battle for fairness is truly won. The story of the Tuesday morning also had a profound impact on how we perceive the everyday. We often think that big events happen in big places, in courtrooms, in legislatures, in executive offices. But this story proved that the world-altering moments happen in the lobby of a local branch, in the checkout line at a grocery store, or in the hallway of an office building. It reminded us that the people we interact with are not just roles. They are human beings with their own stories, their own struggles, and their own value. And we are all in every moment either a witness or a participant in the culture we create. Desmond Turner's life didn't change as much as he changed the world around him. He still drove the same car for a long time, still wore his work jacket, and still took care of his team. He understood that being successful wasn't about the title on the door or the amount in the account. It was about staying grounded in the reality of what mattered. He maintained his commitment to the kids in the financial literacy program, not because he wanted credit, but because he knew the power of being the person who gives someone their first chance. He was the mentor. He never had the guide he knew the next generation desperately needed. The irony is that the man who was once told to crawl back to the hole he came from ended up building a structure that allowed others to stand tall. And the man who thought he could decide who belonged and who didn't ended up being the one who was left out in the cold. It is a powerful narrative of justice, not the kind that is handed down from on high, but the kind that is built through the daily choices of ordinary people who decide that enough is enough. It is a testament to the fact that integrity, when challenged, can become the most powerful force in the room. And in the end, the truth always finds its way out, no matter how much someone tries to bury it in the trash. The legacy of that Tuesday morning also served as a profound wake-up call for the entire financial industry. It wasn't just about one bank or one manager, it was about the systemic blind spots that allowed such a culture of elitism to flourish. Financial institutions started reevaluating their customer profile metrics. They realized that their reliance on rigid, historically biased data was blinding them to potential opportunities and, more importantly, violating their fundamental duty to treat all customers with dignity. The case of First Continental became the standard-bearer for a new kind of accountability. It wasn't about meeting numbers. It was about ensuring that every interaction, every deposit, every loan application, every conversation was handled with a clear, unbiased standard of care. The manager archetype that Bellworth embodied was dismantled, replaced by the need for leaders who could navigate diversity, handle conflict with emotional intelligence, and understand the deep structural history of the communities they served. It was a shift from policing customers to serving them, and the results were clear. Businesses that focused on inclusivity performed better, had higher customer retention, and were more resilient in the face of economic uncertainty. The story of Desmond Turner and the crumpled deposit slip also resonated deeply within the culture of social media and digital activism. It highlighted the power of the citizen journalist, the ordinary person who, by simply recording the truth, could hold power accountable. It emboldened a generation to use their phones not just to capture the mundane, but to bear witness to the significant. It changed the way we think about authority. We no longer accept that someone is right just because they hold a position. We now look for the evidence, the logic, and the humanity behind their actions. It taught us to question the why behind the what. And in doing so, it has made our public spaces more accountable and more equitable. The impact on the individual lives involved was perhaps the most lasting. For the mother, the toddler, the teller, and the security guard, the experience was a pivot point. They didn't just witness an event, they became part of a larger story of change. They learned that they had a voice, and that their voice had power. They saw that even in the face of overwhelming corporate arrogance, the truth could prevail, if enough people were willing to speak up. It was a masterclass in civic responsibility taught in the most unlikely of places. The story of that morning is now part of the folklore of the city. People tell it at community meetings, at financial literacy workshops, and in conversations about what it means to build a better future. It is a story of resilience, of the power of the individual, and of the necessity of standing up for what is right, even when it is uncomfortable. It is a reminder that the world is built by the people who walk through the doors, and that the quality of our society is measured by how we treat the stranger standing next to us in line. Desmond's office today is a place of quiet focus. The framed, crumpled deposit slip on the wall is not a reminder of the man who threw it away. It is a reminder of the moment he stood his ground. It is a receipt for a lesson learned, a permanent marker of a boundary that no one will ever cross again. It stands as a testament to the belief that every person has an inherent value that no amount of bank policy or management opinion can ever diminish. And for those who look at it, it serves as a question: what are you going to do when it's your turn to stand in the lobby? Are you going to be the one who looks away or the one who speaks? The answer to that question is what shapes the future. It is the simple yet profound essence of the human experience. It is the core of everything that matters. And that is why this story continues to resonate long after the news cycle has moved on. As we reflect on the events of that fateful Tuesday, it's clear that the most significant outcome wasn't the financial settlement or the corporate restructuring, but the shift in consciousness. For years, people in the community had experienced the subtle grinding friction of being treated as less than at the local branch, but they had assumed it was just the way things were. The incident brought that invisible bias into the light, giving it a name and a face, and making it impossible for the community to ignore. It created a shared language for what had been happening, and that shared understanding became the bedrock for organized, sustainable change. The bank's internal review wasn't just a PR move. It became a deep dive into the corporate culture that had fostered such blatant disregard for customers. They found that Bellworth's behavior was merely the tip of the iceberg of a larger systemic problem, the assumption that a customer's net worth was the only thing that gave them human worth. The new management had the difficult task of purging that philosophy and replacing it with one that valued every individual. They focused on training, but also on leadership. They looked for people who understood that their role wasn't to gatekeep, but to be a bridge. The impact of this shift was immediate and measurable. Customer satisfaction scores rose, branch deposits increased, and the bank eventually earned a reputation for being the most accessible and fair institution in the region. It was a complete turnaround, driven by the hard realization that their previous strategy had been fundamentally flawed. The incident also highlighted the vital role that middle management plays in shaping the experience of the public. If a manager is allowed to operate with unchecked power, the entire organization suffers. This was the lesson that other banks in the country took to heart. They started looking at their branch managers with new scrutiny, not just for their numbers, but for their people. They started auditing their interactions, implementing anonymous feedback channels, and creating a culture where employees felt empowered to speak up when they saw something wrong. The story became a catalyst for a nationwide rethink of customer service ethics in the financial sector. The legal and regulatory consequences for First Continental Bank were just the beginning. The precedent set by the case was used in multiple other discrimination lawsuits across the country, fundamentally changing how banks were investigated and held accountable. It shifted the burden of proof from the victim to the institution. Banks were now expected to document the reasons for flagging a transaction rather than just relying on the vague, subjective judgment of a manager. This was a massive win for civil rights and consumer protection, a triumph that was born out of one man's quiet refusal to be intimidated. The story of that morning is not just a tale of a man being wronged. It is a tale of a man being right. It is a story of how one person's unwavering commitment to their own dignity can become a beacon for an entire community. It demonstrates that you don't need a position of authority to lead. You just need to be the person who holds on to the truth. When Desmond walked out of that bank, he wasn't just carrying his check. He was carrying the moral weight of a decision that would ripple through the lives of millions. And the people who stood with him, the ones who didn't look away, they were the ones who turned that decision into a movement. The legacy of that Tuesday continues to live on in every teller who listens, in every security guard who is proud of their uniform, and in every customer who walks into a bank expecting and demanding to be treated with respect. It is the story of our ongoing journey toward a society that actually reflects the values it claims to hold. And it is a story that reminds us that we are all in every action defining the future. The final chapter of this story is not written in the history books or the corporate boardrooms. It is written in the lives of the people who were changed by that single defining moment. The young girl who was asleep on her mother's shoulder in the lobby that day. She is growing up in a world where the story of her mother's courage is a part of her own identity. She is learning that her mother was a participant in history, a woman who stood up for what was right when it was the hardest thing to do. This is the true legacy of the incident, the lessons we pass on to the next generation about the power of standing up and the importance of being present. The young man who recorded the video went on to use his skills to create media that highlights the stories of people who are often ignored. He didn't just walk away from the event, he integrated it into his own life's work. The teller who became a community outreach manager is still there every Tuesday, greeting the first-time depositors with a smile that is genuine, welcoming, and entirely devoid of judgment. She is the embodiment of the change she helped to create. These are the ripples of that Tuesday, the quiet, persistent, and powerful echoes of an act of defiance that became a turning point for everyone involved. The bank, now under new and enlightened leadership, has become a model of what a financial institution should be. It is an active partner in the community, a place where people go not just to conduct business, but to build their dreams. It has learned that its greatest asset is not the money in the vault, but the trust of the people it serves. This is the lesson that First Continental learned the hard way, that trust is the currency that actually matters, and that once you lose it, you have to work twice as hard to get it back. The story is now in many ways a piece of civic myth. It is told to remind us that no one is above the law and that everyone is entitled to the same basic respect regardless of what they wear or where they come from. It is a narrative that challenges us to look beyond our biases and to see the person in front of us with all their history, their potential, and their inherent value. As you think about this, remember that your actions, no matter how small, are part of this ongoing story. The choice to be kind, the choice to speak up, the choice to treat someone as you would want to be treated, these are the choices that shape our society. You are the witness, you are the participant, and you are the one who gets to decide what kind of world you want to help create. The story of the bank manager and the man in the work jacket is a stark, powerful reminder of the stakes involved. It's a story that challenges each of us to be better, to be bolder, and to be more human. So the next time you find yourself in a lobby, a store, or an office, look around. Look at the people who are often ignored. Look at the structures that govern our interactions. And ask yourself, what is my role here? What do I stand for? The answer you give is the contribution you make to the world we all share. Because in the end, it's not about the money, the title, or the policy. It's about the people. It's always been about the people. And that is the lesson that stays with you, the lesson that Desmond Turner lived, and the lesson that we are all in our own way trying to learn. This is why we tell the story, why we share it, and why we remember. It is the story of us.